so happy to have you joining us this evening, and we're delighted to have a chalice lighting by Paula Cole Jones. Paula is the founder of Adore, a dialogue on race and ethnicity, a former president of DRUM, the Diverse and Revolutionary Unitarian Universalists Multicultural Ministries. She's an elder in Black Lives UU, a founder of the Eighth Principle Project, and she's an independent consultant specializing in multicultural competencies and institutional change. She lives in Washington, D.C., and I consider her a great collaborator for justice making. Thank you so much. Paula, take it away. Paula, take it away.
Thank you, Pablo, and good evening, everyone. It's good to be here, and it's good to have you here. And we welcome Steve Phillips. We're eager to hear your insights, Steve. And for those of you who have a chalice, feel free to light your chalice to these words of reflection. There are times when we need a bird's eye view to understand the particular moment in which we find ourselves. And it might feel like we're having new experiences when actually we might be in a long experience of unfinished business that needs to be brought to conclusion. In 1966, many of you may be familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King's address to our General Assembly. And these are his words taken from the Ware Lecture, "Don't Sleep Through the Revolution." I quote, "One of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in great periods of change and yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution. And there can be no denying or contradiction of the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our world today. The great question is, what do we do when we find ourselves in such a period? Certainly, the church has a great responsibility, because when the church is true to its nature, it stands as a moral guardian of the community and of society. So we are here, end quote. We are here, we are present as a progressive spiritual community, and we're ready to hear the words of wisdom and inspiration this evening.
Thank you so much, Paula.
There he is.
So with that, I want to take this opportunity in front of this beautiful and lovely large audience to mention that next week on Tuesday, we'll have another great speaker, Mr. Patrick Berry of the Brennan Center for Justice. He's going to be speaking to us about lifetime voting bans. There are about 11 states in the United States that have some version of a lifetime voting ban, most often associated with the carceral system. So please please consider joining us. We'll drop the link in the chat, or you can go to our webpage to find out more. This evening, we're going to hear from Mr. Steve Phillips. Steve is a New York Times best-selling author, a commentator and columnist. He's made appearances for the New York Times, NBC, CNN, MSNBC, and C-SPAN. He does a podcast that goes deeper into some of the issues that he's going to be speaking about this evening with us. And I want everybody here on this call to know that I think what Mr. Phillips has to share with us is extremely important for Unitarian Universalists. When I make appearances in front of congregations,
I tried. I can't. Let's see.
I'm begging you to please mute yourself. Please mute yourselves. When I make appearances in front of UU congregations, I often talk about the
You have to unmute yourself. We're not hearing you.
can you hear me now? It seems like it's open on my end. Okay. When I make appearances in front of UU communities, congregations, I will often talk about the great work of a number of authors. But when I'm thinking about the root causes and why we as Unitarian Universalists give a heck about creating justice in the world, my mind almost always goes to two individuals. One of them is Reverend Barber, for his notion of fusion politics and the work of interrupting and intervening in the interlocking injustices that we see around us. But the other is Steve Phillips, because of this idea that he's drawing attention to, that we are living through a transformational generational opportunity, that BIPOC communities together with progressive folks have a unique opportunity to flex muscle on public policy and in politics and deliver some important new outcomes. And this is particularly important in the context of so many Unitarian Universalists worrying about our apparent flirtations with autocratic government in the United States and even flirtations with fascism. And it seems to me that those flirtations and that inclination that we are so worried about have some root causes. And I think that Steve Phillips is putting his finger on an important root cause. And I think he's highlighting an important and strategic opportunity that we don't want to squander. So with that, I'm going to invite Mr. Steve Phillips, New York Times bestselling author, smart guy, to come and speak to us.
All right.
Steve, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pablo. And then thank all of you for inviting me, and so many of you for being here and being on this call. I think this is actually probably the largest Zoom call I've ever done. And I was looking at the sign in, and there people are from, and then actually people from Durham, North Carolina, and Raleigh. But it just amusingly reminded me of when I went to Raleigh in 1987 when Jesse Jackson kicked off his presidential campaign in 1988, and that for the 88 presidential. And that was a big influential experience in my life. And then we went back. We knew the people with Self-Help Credit Union, which does a lot of work in Durham. And we were going to visit, and somebody from Self-Help says, "Have you ever been to Durham before?" And I said, "I've been to Raleigh." And then this person says, "Have you been to Durham?" Right. So this emphasis that really resonated with me. But I'm really glad to be here in general, and I appreciate the invitation, and I really appreciate the chance to be with progressive and activist people of faith, and that I come to my politics through my faith. My grandfather was a minister in the Glenville Church of God in Cleveland for 50 years. That framework, that orientation, that mandate to manifest the kind of society we want to see here on this earth was always a very present and urgent part of my life and my own upbringing, and the formative political experience of my life, in terms of both my work and my direction and then my analysis, frankly, was the 1984 and 88 Jesse Jackson presidential campaigns, which brought together the civil rights tradition and lineage, and having literally been there with Dr. King by his side during his work and when he was assassinated, along with electoral politics and the galvanizing of the civil rights movement into that space, and then putting all of that in and communicating it with a lot of religious metaphor and framework and language. The 84 convention speech for the whole country. Jesse says that he says, when I was growing up in South Carolina, Reverend Sample used to preach a sermon relating to Jesus. He says, if I be lifted up, I'll draw all men unto me. And then Jesse went on a long explanation about if you raise up truth, it's magnetic and will draw people. And if we lift up a program to feed the hungry, they'll come running. Study War No More, or youth will come running. So that framework helped to shape me. And so I'm really delighted to be with others who have that orientation around how these traditions and this work fuses and manifests itself in this time period. Was delighted to be at All Souls last year for that conversation, and also had another connection point at that time in terms of one of the most formative books that I've read, this was in the 1980s, was Taylor Branch's Parting the Waters, both substantively in terms of immersing me deeply in the minutia of the civil rights movement, as well as a writer, showing how to illustrate what's going on and connect it to the larger national trends at a time. And so that was a very, powerful impact on me from that time period. And it wasn't until I went back to All Souls, and I looked at his book, Parting the Waters, he dedicates it. It says, for the choir of All Souls Unitarian Church, Washington, D.C. So in a lot of ways, I really feel, a sense of family and commitment and connection to being here with you today. And I think that this is a pivotal moment and critical time to be having this conversation around what is the role, what is the imperative, and what actions should we be taking given the challenge that we're facing today. And I do think it's relevant to look at and think about both the work that King had done, the work that was happening at that point, the reference, that even Taylor Branch was giving back to the work of All Souls, and the role that the faith community played in the 1960s was a critical role around making a moral witness. And that was imperative and played a significant role, I think, in terms of summoning people to action and getting people to take a stand and getting people to take a stand on the side of justice and the side of this being a multiracial democracy in a multiracial country. And it's interesting, as I'm reading this, a new biography of King, Jonathan Igue, is called King. And I've been reading this more recently. He goes into great detail about all these elements of the civil rights movement. And one of the things that really struck me was how much of the strategies of that time period, by necessity, focused on making a moral witness, making the argument, convincing the country, convincing people to side with the cause of the movement. And in a lot of ways, that was the primary strategy, because there weren't many other strategies that could work. And that was not, the composition of the country was such that if you're going to try to get majority support for social justice, people had to be challenged, minds had to be changed, and issues had to be dramatized in the way they were at that time. But it's I think about that and compare that to this moment, the strategies can, and I would argue, should be very different, in that the composition of the country has changed so dramatically that the form of action that we take and what we actually move forward on can be very different. And this is what I really try to lay out in my book, How We Win the Civil War. And it's also what I try to lay out my first book, Brown is the New White, about how the country has changed. So actually, when King was killed, the country was approximately 12% people of color. Today, the country is 41% people of color. And so you take that reality, and this is what I really try to illustrate in my books, is that historically, social change in this country and politics in this country have been a contest among white people. And that you have more progressive white people battling against more conservative white people over the whites in the middle. So it manifests itself in everything from the Declaration of Independence, those who wanting to condemn slavery and those who wanting to continue slavery, and then who is in the middle around where are they going to side in terms of comprising the majority. And that is how politics and how social change in this country played out for most of the country's history. And also because there was not enough people of color to be able, first of all, people of color couldn't participate by law in the governing process, period, but there weren't enough people of color. And I've gone back and run the numbers and quantified even Reagan's election and Obama's election. So if Obama had run in '84 against Reagan, he would not have won with the coalition that he had. The country was not diverse enough. It was still too white at that time. But because the composition of the country has changed so much that we've taken down the whites only signs in terms of for one, actual public facilities, but also the whites only immigration policy, which was the dominant immigration policy in this country. Going back to 1790, very first law was passed that to be a U.S. citizen, you'd be a free white person. And that was the official law up until the 1950s, and it was the practice until the 1960s. But that, because of the civil rights movement, that changed in 65. And with the Voting Rights Act, many more people of color came into the electorate. And so the social change world and the political formula has changed now. So now the minority of whites who are progressive whites allied with people of color, really the overwhelming majority of people of color, is a majority of people within this country. And that's the majority that elected the country's first Black president and reelected the country's first Black president, and is a growing and ascendant force within this within the U.S. And I illustrate in the first book how every single day, and this is because of these trends, right? So because we had a whites only immigration policy for so long, and I don't even say that to say that, just say it provocatively. There's Supreme Court decisions in the 20th century where there was two cases. Indian man and a Japanese man wanted to be U.S. citizens, went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't become U.S. citizens because you're not white. And the law specifically says free white persons. And so it was very explicitly a whites-only immigration policy that we had. But the result of that was the country was overwhelmingly and unnaturally white. And then the result of that today is that most old people are white because that's who was only within the country. That as the country has diversified over the past 30, 40, 50 years, that most of the younger people are people of color. So the result of this is that every single day, in terms of the population, 7,000 new people of color are added to the population as compared to whites in terms of net population growth, as births, deaths, and legal immigration. And so what that has meant is that we have changed the composition of the country's population. And that then plays itself out in terms of social change and in terms of elections, that we have the ability to actually change the composition of the electorate. And that's really where we are at in terms of the country today. And so we've seen this play itself out most significantly in Georgia in recent years in terms of how this has worked itself out. There's actually one more thing about this before, though. So as a result of this changing composition, the strategies and the roles and the focus and the emphasis and the allocation of limited time, energy, and resources can be different. And so, whereas before in the 50s and the 60s, there was a by necessity having to rely upon largely upon moral persuasion and also economic pressure in terms of, the Montgomery bus boycott and things like that. Now, civic engagement, voter registration, voter mobilization, people participating in the elections, that can lead to transforming policies, priorities, the composition of the elected leadership of a city, county, state, or the country. And so the implications of that are different. We no longer have to be trying to primarily or solely try to win over the whites who are unconvinced and reluctant. Investing in supporting groups, leaders, people who are doing the work of getting communities of color registered to vote and able to vote, that is in fact the more doable and powerful path to be able to transform the country. And that's what I try to lay out within the book, How We Win the Civil War. And so I offer multiple case studies there. One of the most significant ones being the situation in Georgia over the past decade, really over the past 15 years or so, right? And so Georgia, there was a white state legislator in Georgia named Denmark Groover, and he has to his legacy is two pieces of legislation. One was the creation of runoff elections, which were explicitly, and he's on the record of saying that because he actually had run and had run an election that was multiple candidates, and he had lost by there had been a situation where a Black candidate with a consolidated Black vote had gotten more votes, a plurality of votes, where the white vote was splintered. And that allowed the Black candidate to get through. And he was like, that's not going to happen again. And so he passed runoff elections specifically to prevent that situation where there's multiple white candidates, splintered white vote, and a consolidated Black vote. And so so even if a Black person comes in first, the runoff would require that they run again, just the top two people, so that the white vote could all consolidate again, and then to try to defeat the person in the runoff election. And that was law passed by Denmark Groover in the 1960s. And that still is the law in Georgia. I mean, that's where that came from and why that came about. The other thing Denmark Groover did and was famous for is that he changed the composition of the Georgia state flag. And so they embedded the Confederate flag in the Georgia state flag. And I'll never forget when I went to visit Georgia, and I think it was 1988. I went to Dr. King's, where Dr. King is buried. And I was like, why is the Confederate flag flying over Martin Luther King? Because they had the Georgia state flag there, but the Confederate flag was embedded there. It was a very intentional statement. This was not the flag from 1860s. They had brought it back in the 1950s and 1960s as a direct response to the rise of the civil rights movement to affirm that Georgia has these Confederate roots and these Confederate values. And that was the state flag of Georgia, which is obviously an offense to anybody who wants us to be a multiracial democracy, and particularly to African Americans. And so, to his credit, the then governor and the last Democratic governor of Georgia, Roy Barnes, was supportive of a ballot measure to remove the Confederate flag from the Georgia state flag. And so they were able to actually do that. And that's one of the last things that Roy Barnes did as an elected official. The backlash to his effort to remove the Confederate flag was so strong that they voted him out of office in 2010. What that did do is that created a vacuum in the state leadership into which young Black woman Stacey Abrams stepped. And Stacey focused very intentionally, and she had seen the same kind of approach and analysis that I had come to learn about and appreciate during the Rainbow Coalition campaigns, where Jesse talked about the old minorities coming together, comprise a new majority, that progressive whites and people of color together can transform politics, to the extent that he won the Georgia primary in the '88 presidential election. Stacey had seen that and appreciated it and learned it. So I met Stacey a decade ago, and she said to me, "There's 1 million unregistered people of color in Georgia. I'm going to register them to vote." And then she set about the work of registering them to vote. This is the point I'm saying, that it's not just an issue any longer of moral persuasion of those who are reluctant or resistant. It's the empowering of those who are the new American majority by registering and mobilizing and maximizing that presence at the polls and changing the composition of the electorate. And so over the course of a decade, Stacey did that work methodically through the community organizations, through the coalitions she was part of, to the extent that then in 2020, Georgia ousted the defender of white nationalism, who was the president of the United States at that time. But on election night, current president Joe Biden says, "We're leading in Georgia." That's not one we expected, because he did not see it and not invested in it and not committed to the work around trying to change the composition of the electorate. And his team, frankly, did not appreciate the potential of what can be done, the transformative potential by changing the composition of who's voting and who's participating. So that work occurred. And then what that accomplished in terms of what this represents to us in terms of the future and the roadmap around how to go about making change is, not only did it have that impact on the presidential election, but that coalition, that work of bringing the new population majority into making an electoral majority, elected to the United States Senate through runoff elections, and actually prevailing in the runoff elections that Delmar Groover had created. Raphael Warnock, the literal successor to Martin Luther King at Ebenezer Baptist Church, has been elected to the United States Senate and brought that voice then. So where we had to only do persuasion, where we had the ministers, we had Dr. King working in a certain context, now the voice, that role, that leadership has gone to the United States Senate. And not only gone to the United States Senate, but gone to the United States Senate and changed the composition and the priorities of the entire United States Congress because of that work. And so I feel that that illuminates what the path ahead can be, in that you can both do the work of changing the priorities and the composition of the electorate, composition of the elected people, and then the direction and really, frankly, even the moral foundation of the government and what its priorities are going to be, in terms of really responding to the whole range of issues, from historic climate change legislation, moving billions of dollars to address the global pandemic and provide money directly to people to keep them from falling into poverty, falling further into poverty through the pandemic, and to electing or appointing and confirming the first Black woman to the U.S. Supreme Court. All of that is because of the work, in large part because of the work that was done in Georgia to change the composition by investing in changing the composition of the electorate. So that, I believe, is the path. And this is what I try to lay out in my book, is that path has been followed to success in former bastions of the Confederacy. So Georgia obviously being one, Texas being another. Texas was part of Mexico. The whole war around Texas became a republic so that it could try to perpetuate slavery. The war with Mexico, because they wanted to be able to continue to exercise slavery, which led to the annexation of much of the South, all around being able trying to continue the legal practice of holding human beings in bondage. That's what happened in Virginia, the state where African Americans were brought, or Africans were brought in 1619. The actual capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War was in Richmond, Virginia. And now, within Virginia, after a decade of work to organize and register and mobilize the new American majority of people, that, and Jesse Jackson's talk about the hands that once picked cotton can now pick presidents, that the Virginia now has, for the first time ever, as the head of its House of Delegates, an African American, descendant of slaves who were brought to Virginia in 1619. That state that was formerly the Confederate capital now has a African American leading that house. And so that all of that is, I think, gives us instruction around where we're at and what we actually have to accomplish. And so I believe that the imperative this hour, particularly this year, where there is a referendum around what kind of country we are going to be, has to be about a crusade about democracy and voting, and getting as many people as possible to vote, many people of color as possible to vote, as much resources, support, money, and assistance to those doing the work of trying to get people to vote. That is, to me, the imperative of 2024 in particular. And I do think that the moral witness part remains important and will be increasingly important, and in particularly important, more important, even more, frankly, next year, if in fact we are able to preserve democracy, because then we get to the question around what kind of country are we going to actually be? What is going to be our social contract, and what are our priorities going to be? It's also important this year, and I do think there's an important role for the progressive faith community to play, to help to define the debate and to help to define the choice and to frame it in stark moral terms. And I think there's a reluctance which really flows from poor math skills from many of the people in political leadership who fear that being too strong on the moral issues will be political losers. And you see it particularly, you see around this whole border issue in terms of like this attempts to try to show how strong they are on the border, et cetera, and the current White House. And so they're trying to like send these signals as if they're going to win all this support, or they're going to lose support if they have a more humanitarian approach to the crisis of people trying to care for their lives and their families, in the context of what's going on at the border and whatnot. That's not being driven by morality. That's being driven by a political calculation. And the challenge, and I think it's a political miscalculation, because I think it's an underappreciation for the realities of this new American majority, back to the Biden team not understanding and investing in the potential, seeing what's possible in Georgia, then not appreciating what the appetite is for a progressive, moral public policy agenda. So that, I believe that the progressives often miscalculate how much popular support there is. I was talking with Michael Tubbs, who was the mayor of Stockton, who was the leader of the creator of Mayors for Guaranteed Income within the network within the country. That's now grown from 10 mayors, well, from one of Michael to 165 mayors are all on part of this network for Mayors for Guaranteed Income. And actually, he was telling me that they had met at the White House, and there was reluctance and skepticism about trying to advance that issue because they don't think there's political support for it. But they'd actually polled on it. And so there's like 60+% approval for universal basic income, which is what Dr. King was calling for in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? What he was calling for at the end of his life with the Poor People's Campaign. So at a certain level, there's a lack of appreciation for the appetite for moral social justice policy agenda. And I do think there's a role for the faith community to lift that up and to offer that to the country and to challenge people. Because that's the fundamental, and that's the last point I wanted to make, is that there is so I have the new edition of my book coming out in March. And I've done a new preface in this. And I draw from and I frame it based upon a conversation Taylor Branch had with Isabel Wilkerson, the author of the book Caste, in 2018. And this was right around the time of the multiple, you can't really call them anything other than white domestic terrorism attacks within this country. So the Tree of Life Synagogue in New York, which I didn't even fully appreciate until I was writing the book and telling the actual story in chronology. This was right before the midterm elections in 2018. Trump was trying to whip up fear and resentment among white voters around brown people south of the border. And they talk about the Central American caravan coming to the country. So Trump would talk about that. And he got his National Department of Homeland Security to talk about there's this caravan and there's all these criminals in the caravan coming to our border. And this was days before the midterm election. So they were deliberately doing this in that context. And that is when the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting happened. And the man who murdered the members of that synagogue was tracking this, blamed the synagogue for being supportive of immigrants from Central America, says, I'm going in, and shot and killed them. And this was the Friday of the week that Trump had started this whole drumbeat around this central caravan. And so it was in that context that Wilkerson and Taylor Branch had this conversation, and Branch says to her, where do you think we are? Do you think we're in the 1950s, or is this, 1800s, or what do you think we are? And Wilkerson says, I think we're in the 1880s. And he says, well, that's very bleak, et cetera. And then he says to her, she says, well, looking at these domestic terrorism incidents, so you would have that. You'd had the South Carolina shooting in 2015. There was a El Paso. There was a similar shooting. There's a mass shooting. There was someone left behind a manuscript saying that Latinos are taking over the country. There had been bombs created and sent to, Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, et cetera, by somebody, again, feeling like and saying that people of color are taking over this country. And so what Branch said to Wilkerson is, people said they would not stand for being minority in their own country, white people. And that the question is, given a choice between democracy and whiteness, how many would choose whiteness? And Wilkerson says, we let that hang in the air for a minute, neither of us willing to hazard an answer to it. And when I talk about in the introduction to my book about it's a choice between democracy and whiteness, and then many people chose whiteness on January 6th and deliberately did not choose democracy and went after the democratic process and tried to stop it, wearing shirts saying MAGA Civil War, carrying the Confederate flag. And so what I try to lay out in the book, in this preface for the new edition of the book, is that I feel like this is 1876. That's after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, we'd had, approximately a decade of trying to move towards making this more of a multiracial democracy, where we're going to continue to go forward in that direction, or we're going to hand the country back to the slave owners. That was the essence of the election of 1876, which led to the near stalemate or actual stalemate that was resolved by the Compromise of 1877, Hayes-Tilden, where the Southerners conceded the White House in exchange for white people getting back the South, pulled out the troops of all the Southern states, slaveholders took control again, and we had legalized white nationalist rule in almost half of the country for 100 years. That's the existential battle that we are still facing today. And you could see it more recently, even in this presidential election, with Nikki Haley refusing to say what happened or why the Civil War began, and trying to talk about size of government and all of this, and refusing to acknowledge slavery because she knew that it was politically fatal in the Republican Party to criticize the Civil War. And that's where we are at in this country at this point in time, is are we going to move forward towards this being a multiracial democracy, or are we going to go backwards to really try to make America white again? And I think there's an important role for the faith community to frame the election in that fashion, to pose that choice to people. And frankly, I think that's the way to get the maximum white support, is to force people to take a stand explicitly on these issues. And that's something that's not done enough, and people are let off the hook too much about it. So that's, I think, the fundamental context of this election. And I would just say that beyond that, there needs to be a witness and a articulation of a new social contract, and a social contract that's rooted in foundations of morality and commitment to one another, things like universal basic income, et cetera, coming from the place of the society that we want to have, this beloved community concept. And what I've tried to document in my work is that I actually believe that the numbers show quite strongly that there's majority support for that agenda, which is different than was the case 50 years ago. And so it's even more reason for us to step forward, lift up our voices, and put forward the moral agenda of what this country could and should be, and rewrite this social contract, since there's so little appreciation for the previously existing one, as we saw on January 6th and beyond, and the continued defense of that. So this is, I believe, a existential election year, and I think there's a critical role for all of us to play. And I particularly feel that the progressive faith community in general, and Unitarian Universalists in particular, can play a very significant role. And that's why I appreciate this invitation and the chance to share with you. And so that's what I wanted to share. I don't know if people have any questions or comments. I'd love to have some dialogue around that.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. I'm going to place myself into the spotlight with you. And at this point, I'm going to ask folks to put into the chat their questions. But also, if you feel that you can stay away from making statements and really make questions, then I will invite you to raise your electronic hand, and we'll try to do that live. But I know that I had one question that someone drew to my attention early on, and they would like you to speak, Steve, to how much, I mean, I think you've sort of answered this question, but how much of the vitriol, how much of the dysfunction that we're seeing right now ties back specifically to the election of Obama and the agenda that he tried to bring forward?
A very significant amount of it. I mean, it's no accident that we had a president as supportive of white nationalism following the first Black president. And it's been quite quantified. I talk about some in my book, both the chapter of fear of a Black president, that they've done different studies, and that's all, particularly like this whole the rise of the Tea Party opposition. And that, not only that, actually, the best example I open up the chapter with is that there's a very strong rise, alarming rise in talk and activity and participant membership among white domestic terrorist groups that was directly tied to the ascendance of Obama as the president. So that is very much the situation in terms of why we're in the situation that we're in. So you take that, then you take Trump getting elected, and people forget that he was kind of a political joke in May of 2015. And then he announced his campaign, called Mexicans murderers and rapists, said he's going to defend white people within this country, shot to the top of the Republican polls, and has stayed there ever since. So I definitely think those things are connected. Somebody has in here a question about, is there hope? So I don't think I sufficiently emphasized that there is hope and that there is a new American majority within this country. That those people who want this to be a multiracial democracy, who do not subscribe to the notion and the views that this should primarily be a white country, though the proponents of multiracial democracy are the majority of people, which is exactly why there's so much effort to stop people from voting. And so there's that reality. The size of those who do want to make this country white again is a larger percentage of the population than people are comfortable admitting. But it's not the majority. It's around 42, 43, 44% of the country, but that's shrinking every day. But that illuminates the imperative to manifest the actual majority. But the hope is that we are the majority. And so that is, to me, what I both take solace in, but also illuminates what is the path ahead, is to make sure that as many people as possible of this multiracial majority are able to vote and do vote in the elections.
Thank you, Steve. And I'll just, again, reiterate, I feel that every Unitarian Universalist should understand this basic assertion that Steve just made. One of the value addeds that we as Unitarian Universalists can have if we choose to step into our power to organize our people, organize our money, and organize our political voice is to help foment that generational and transformational change. And so with that in mind, Steve, I want to ask you, there are several questions that go to, can you speak or share thoughts on why there is a declining support among Black and Hispanic voters, especially youth voters, and in general, what we can do to bring into concern and involvement those folks who are in disenfranchised or populations that feel like they're not being heard right now.
Yeah, well, I'll start from the specific and get to the somewhat more general piece, is that there's also, you can have people talk about it's almost like reverse coattails. And so by emphasizing local issues that are relevant and pressing, that whether it's criminal justice reform, whether it's progressive district attorneys, whether it's local or state minimum wage measures, and whether it's, we've seen a number of elections, reproductive freedom as well. Emphasizing those issues are ways to clarify for people that where it may not be as clear as we would like among sometimes the candidates at the top of the ticket, that at the local level, those things make a difference. So, that in terms of people who have had experience with the criminal justice system, know it needs to change, that can be a motivating factor towards some of the people who are not as motivated. And I think that the enthusiasm is the big challenge that we actually face. And moving up from that a little bit, part of that I also think is then also to challenge to the extent we talk about the election, well, anybody who's spending money and resources on the campaign is to be putting money into much less money on television and much more money into the hands of groups who are hiring people from the communities to make sure that everybody is aware of what the issues are and that they're registered, that they can actually turn out to vote. Spending more money on voter mobilization, less money on television. But I would also just say writ large that I wouldn't overreact around these different, stories, which sometimes can get somewhat alarmist. And people talk about, decline in Black male support, et cetera. Black men are the most progressive demographic grouping in the country of any group in the whole country, except for Black women. So even for all the talk about, Black men are declining and getting, et cetera, they still far more progressive than any other demographic grouping within the country. And so let's not get overly carried away in that direction. And then similarly this year with Latinos, the other thing that's been less appreciated is that to the extent that we've seen people were looking at like a county or a city, like there's a Hidalgo, Texas, and it's in the numbers were different and it was closer than it had been in that largely Latino county. It wasn't because Latinos are defecting. It's that because the conservative, who were not non-voters have been coming out in bigger numbers, which then gets back to the imperative about making sure that the progressive non-voters actually come out in larger numbers. That's the prescription around that. And I wouldn't overly react that there's this huge bleeding of support towards the Republicans. There is a question around motivation to participate, period. And that's what I was saying we have to emphasize from the down ballot issues.
Thanks, Steve. I really appreciate that answer. In your comments, you put a pin in the notion of the social contract needs to be reestablished or renegotiated. So our audience would like some guidance from you, some of your thoughts on which parts of the social contract we need to focus on to shift the deciding factors away from issues of abortion and LGBTQ plus issues, which can be alienating sometimes to religious people in general, and according to the news, people of color. Is it economics? Is it something else? What aspect of the social contract deserves the majority of our, or not deserve, but would benefit from a focus?
Well, I'm a big believer in part of it. I came into social change work was around the imperative around trying to address poverty. And I think that is an issue that kind of works across the board. And it's ready-made for the, faith community to talk about a humane and moral society. A wealthy society should not have people in poverty. And how does that manifest our values? And so there's that issue in general. And so that leads towards things like universal basic income and trying to lift that up. And there's increasing momentum around that. And then I would link to that, again, that was Dr. King's last call, the Poor People's Campaign, his last book. It's ties to all these other issues, that in terms of housing and education and et cetera. And so, as King says in his last book, we try to solve poverty by solving these other things first, whereas he'd come to believe, which I think he was correct, that the best way to address poverty is to address poverty and through a guaranteed basic income. And that is in a lot of ways what we saw and did. And I talk about this in the epilogue to my book. Universal basic income sends a check to people. And there's all this like, oh, well, they're going to be responsible or, et cetera. If it's support. But then we had a pandemic and then everybody got a check. And so the notion around, oh, you can send checks to people if you actually have that value set. We've shown that we can actually do that. So I think that's an issue that's very hard to oppose in terms of ending poverty, prioritizing ending poverty, embracing universal basic income. I think it's tailor-made for the faith community. And I think it's a winning issue. And I was saying, Michael Dubs has shown that the polling they have is that it's actually a winning issue as well. And so on all these different levels, I think that's an excellent place to emphasize and support.
Thank you, Steve. That's an insightful approach to that question. I would be, there's so many great questions in the chat, but I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the issue of what do you think Biden should be doing about Gaza and Palestine and Israel? So, given that so many young people, speaking to this difference that you've been highlighting, that so many young people are furious with him and with their elders in society for not taking action.
And I was recently rereading Dr. King's speech at Riverside Church, Time to Break Silence, where he speaks out about the Vietnam War. And I'm increasingly feeling like that this is also a time to break silence, is that if you're not for a ceasefire, what are you for? Are you almost by definition, are you then for war? And so it is disappointing, the reticence and the timidity But I do think that this is a situation where we all have to start lifting up our voice. And yes, it's a complicated situation. Yes, there is a lot of anti-Semitism in our society, in our world, and people are being killed and slaughtered. And so to call the humanitarian, the moral, I think the right thing to do is to support the call for a ceasefire. That doesn't negate any of the other issues that are out there, but it really feels like more of us have to be lending our voice to that. And then frankly, I think the reason that the Biden administration is not doing that is because they're afraid of the political backlash. But the more people who are calling for it, the broader the coalition calling for it will actually make it safer for the administration, for the president to call for it.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you for stimulating our thinking about our strategic role and understanding of the root causes for what we see around us, the vitriol. And
I quickly invite people. So I'm doing weekly Facebook Lives that are also Q&A opportunities. So there's a ton of great questions here. So at noon on Fridays and noon Eastern time, 9 o'clock Pacific, I'm live on Facebook. You can go to my personal website through the Democracy in Color Facebook page, and then you can join me on Facebook, and we can kind of maybe get some of these other questions as well.
Absolutely, and we will share that information with people as part of the follow-up. I do want to invite Paula Cole Jones to close a sacred space for us, and then share with folks. I will hold some space afterwards to help you process. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for having me. Great.
So thank you so much for what you shared. I love your matter-of-factness about it. We've been hearing about the shift in demographics for decades. And I think we saw it with the 2 elections of President Obama. We did something we didn't know we can do. And I love the way that you've kind of analyzed it and helped us to see that we have the power. We have a lot more power. We just have to keep leaning in and moving forward. And with that, I want to share with you that we've been centering in our association and our congregations kind of a spiritual call to Unitarian Universalists. Around this, we call it the 8th principle, and we have now close to 300 congregations that have independently adopted it for themselves. And it's let us journey towards spiritual wholeness by building the multicultural beloved community, or we could say democracy, right? The multicultural beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and oppression in ourselves and our institutions. So we're holding ourselves to that and centering it, trying to in all that we do. So I really appreciate, I feel like you've kind of clarified for us in a sense, the call to keep on moving in this direction. And I want to close again with a historic benediction. I grew up in All Souls Church, and Reverend David Eaton used to use these words so frequently, and they just resonate today. These words are by Barrows Dunnan. Now, therefore, since the struggle deepens, since evil abides and good does not yet prosper, let us gather what strength we have, what confidence and valor, that our small victories may end in triumph, and the world awaited be a world attained. May it be so. Thank you all.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you for being a champion and a wonderful church elder, helping all of us make forward progress on this journey.
Thank you, Pablo, for bringing this to us.
So now I see so many faces that I know, others that I don't. This is the time in our events where we say we give a soft close. We allow anybody who's got to do something else, our speakers, if they've got another event, to go do that. But like after services at church, those who want to hang around the coffee table and process a little bit what they heard and ask questions, this is an opportunity to do that in a bit of fellowship, because we know that that's an important aspect of UUSJ culture, of UUs for social justice. You guys always get angry at me when I skip this portion. So please feel free to roll off if that's what you want to do. But if you want to stick with us, ask a question of me, of the rest of the community, then now is a chance to do that, and we'll give it a few minutes and sort of do that slow processing. Steve.